And hello, everyone, and welcome back to Two Guys in the Bible here on Fulfilled Radio, a voice you can trust. We do so appreciate you being with us. That's William Bell over here, and my name is Don K. Preston. He is administrator, owner of allthingsfulfilled.com. William has written thousands of articles. William and I have traveled together, spoken together in Australia, many other places and what have you. William and I have been working together for well over 40 years. But anyway, my name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. And I hope you're doing as well as William and I are doing. Now, I do have to start out by saying William won the nice shirt contest. Last week, we both had really nice shirts on. And I said, William actually said we were going to have a poll as to who had the prettiest shirt. And believe it or not, on my own YouTube channel, William got the votes for the prettiest shirt. So I immediately blocked all of those people who voted that way. I'm just kidding, of course. So anyway, we had some fun with that. But we do appreciate you being back with us. We are still in Isaiah chapter 49, but a little bit of maybe news first. William, what's going on in your world?
Well, I got a call from a gentleman today from the UK. I think he's spoken with you maybe as well. And he was very excited about having discovered you and me as well, and is really looking forward to doing some things about it, not just kind of sitting around talking about it, but he's interested in even bringing us to the UK.
Yes.
If that can be arranged. So I'm sure he probably talked to you about that some.
Yes, indeed.
So I don't want to tell the whole story. Why don't you pick it up from there and tell the rest of the story?
Well, I'm probably about as in the dark as you are. I had never heard of this gentleman before. Mm-hmm. And I get this Facebook Messenger telling me a little bit about how he had been following the ministry, and he was as well following your ministry. And he was just absolutely blown away and thrilled at the message. He said that he was in partnership with churches in both France and in England. I don't know exactly what that partnership means in the jargon of France or England, but nonetheless, he said that he was in partnership with them. Said he had been blessed sufficiently where he wants to officially invite us over there to speak. He thinks that he can get ministers to come and attend a seminar. Maybe it may be nothing but some teaching classes or whatever. So I did tell him today that my wife had informed me that if she didn't go, I don't go. So, and he said, fantastic. He said, I'll be more than honored to do that. So I told him, I said, well, give us some details on what you have in mind, what you think you can, get planned out. And so I had assumed that he was going to contact you. And so I was going to ask you actually off air if he had, but the way he was talking, I had assumed that he was in contact with you as well. So that's exciting that we may get the opportunity to do some traveling again overseas. That would be really, really cool.
Yeah, he called me this morning, and we talked for about an hour, actually. And learned that he was originally from Cameroon, but he had grown up, I think, in France, and he, as you say, he has some connections in England as well. And he works for a hotel, so he said that a lot of that is taken care of. A 5-star hotel, can you imagine? So that's good.
I like this already.
Yeah. And so he said accommodations would be no problem whatsoever. But he was just totally excited about the study and his wanting to be involved. And he mentioned that he felt like he could really be a good resource and catalyst for moving this forward. And he wanted to, he expressed the idea that he was really grateful that, we had sort of laid the groundwork and the foundation, and he wanted to build on that and keep pushing forward.
Yeah, I was just super thrilled when I got his Facebook Messenger, and I was right in the middle of about 14,000 different things, and I couldn't read carefully every single thing that he said, and I didn't have time to talk to him, in a phone call or anything like that. So I very, very much look forward to speaking to him on the phone. I look forward to him giving some further details. It sounded like he gave you a good bit there. So I told him, I said, well, it's going to be exciting to see what doors the Lord opens on this, and to see what can come of it. It's really, really exciting. So, folks, we want those of you who are viewing this program, we want you to keep this in your prayers, please, that it comes to fruition, that it brings glory and honor to the Lord, and helps spread the news of fulfillment, in places that maybe we don't think about as being active as far as Christianity is concerned. Certainly not London. And to a great extent, France as well. Both of those are very, very secular places. There are enclaves of Christianity that are pretty active. And so I'm assuming those are the people that he's in touch with. And so, like I said, the more I thought about it, the more excited I became. And so we'll see what happens. I'm getting on up there. I'm not a young spring chick anymore. And Jan asked, she said, do you think you're up to that? And I said, I will certainly work on it. That's about all I can say.
There you go.
Give me my afternoon nap, and I'll see where that leads.
There you go. Another thing that happened, this past week was, I think I told you about, I told you about that as well. There was a debate between Phelan McPhalen, who is a historical premillennialist, former preterist, and also Dr. Sungenis, who's a Catholic, I think. But anyway, they had a debate on the millennium. So I made a few comments on the page regarding some time statements that they got into, over. And he wrote me back sort of a pretty decent sized paragraph, but they put all of these statements in there in the one paragraph. So it's argument after argument, or statement after statement. And I just decided to just take the statement at a time and just go through and answer everything. Well, he responded by recording a full-length 1-hour video. and it was really interesting, because at the very end, he went through things, and I thought he was going to hit the last argument. He said, well, we're out of time here. And that was the one on the millennium. I wanted to see what he had to say about it. He did. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back and take the responses that he made, and I'm going to do some videos. I'll probably put them in a playlist and make them short, where I just answer one point at a time, and people can listen to where they want this the whole thing. But I think there's some value, and he agreed with quite a bit of what I said in there. I mean, it's like, I agree that the apostles didn't teach anything but what was found in the law and in the prophets. I just don't believe all of it was fulfilled like they said it was.
And he agreed that the time statements have to be taken at their face value.
Exactly.
But that's where he kind of veered off into the millennium concept. And so, okay.
But he also said that if those time statements have to be fulfilled, if those time statements have to be taken that way in Revelation, etc., he said that means that the millennium had to have started during the Pentecost time frame. So, I mean, he recognizes that has to be a short period of time for the millennium compared to the literal 1,000 years, that's or 2,000 years and counting that's going on currently.
That's right. I think you need to be just a tad closer to your mic there, William.
Oh, okay, sure.
Yeah, there you go. That's better. Might pull it over to you or something.
I'm getting too relaxed, leaning back in the chair. That's what.
Yeah, I better not get too relaxed. I'll guarantee you, because I woke up at 2:00 this morning. So, well, that's exciting. That's really, really exciting. I'll just make note of this. Barry Isaac, who runs the Preterist Perspectives debate discussion forum on Facebook, contacted me and shared with me a bunch of claims on the Olivet Discourse that Sam Frost had been making. I am no longer a part of the Facebook page where Sam posted his material. It's the Facebook page entitled Full Preterism, a Thing of the Past. Well, I withdrew from that Facebook page probably 2, maybe 3 years ago, because some of the leading members, the majority posters, were caught in blatant, outright lies. And as it turned out, several other of the leading posters knew he was lying and refused to call him down. and refused to condemn him. And so I withdrew from that page. Well, Barry Isaac shared with me some of the things that Sam was claiming about the Olivet Discourse. And it just, I'll try to be respectful here, but some of the most nonsensical stuff you've ever read in your life. And so Barry asked me if I would possibly address it. So I posted today on my website, donkpreston.com, and it'll be on Bible Prophecy as well. I also posted it on my Facebook page and about 15 other Facebook pages as well. And it's Sam Frost's abuse of the Olivet Discourse. I'm sure it's just going to thrill him to death. So, but as I said, it's one of the most nonsensical bit of posting that you're ever going to read. And it violates every single thing in the content. It violates his own hermeneutic that he lays out. He contradicts himself. And then he turns right around and does it all over again. And he violates everything that Jesus said. The main thing that I hope that readers will see is that Sam reads his assumptions and presuppositions into the text without telling anybody what he has done. He just assumes it to be true and then builds his arguments on that assumption. And in logical terms, that's petitio principii. I don't know if I pronounced that correctly, but everybody kind of gets the point. It's assuming to be true what you have to prove to be true.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't even try. Did not offer one keystroke to establish and to prove his basic fundamental assumption, and that is that the apostles were asking about the end of time. He just took it for granted.
Yeah.
So anyway, for those of you who are interested in reading that, like I said, you'll be able to read it on my website, donkpreston.com or bibleprophecy.com. And it's also on my Facebook page, just Don Preston. So take advantage of that and give me your feedback. Let me know what you think about it.
All right. I'll look forward to reading it.
Yeah. Well, my wife, who's totally unbiased, of course, says it was fantastic. So there you go. What else do we need?
Can't argue.
Can't argue with that.
That's right.
Okay, folks, we want to get back into Isaiah chapter 49. We have covered to a certain extent what the prophet said was to be the ministry and the message of the Messiah. It is too small of a thing for you to be the Redeemer of Jacob and to restore the tribes of Jacob. I will also make you a light to the Gentiles. Now, one person pointed out to me, William, that the word Gentiles is just simply the word ethnos. No, I'm sorry, it's genos. And it is literally people. And so this individual, he's not IO, he's not Israel only, but he was saying, well, it doesn't literally say Gentiles. Well, it really does when you look at the Hebrew parallelism that is in Isaiah 49. You're going to be the salvation of Israel, the 12 tribes of Israel. Then you're also going to be the light to the people, to the rest of the people. So it doesn't have to say allotros. It doesn't have to use the words that are used for foreigner. Pardon me, allogenes. It doesn't have to use those. In the Hebrew parallelism, and then a contrast of the parallelism, it's obviously contrasting the tribes of Jacob, of Israel, versus the people. And they're all inclusive in the work of the Messiah. Then we got down to the fact, and William, I wanted you to make some comments on this, because to me, this is one of the most powerful statements against dispensationalism that could ever be made. Because the Lord says, I'm going to make you, that's the Messiah, as a covenant to the people to restore the earth. Well, in the Hebrew, that's eretz, for land. And in the Greek, it's gi, for land, sometimes of earth, but in the great majority of places, simply land. So here we have a prophecy, just like in Ezekiel chapter 37, of the restoration to the land. Okay?
Mhm.
Now, the dispensationalists tell us, well, look what happened in 1948. That's the restoration of Israel to the land. How does that claim, William, that Israel was restored to the land in 1948, how does that settle with what the prophet said, that all of this would take place in the acceptable time and in the day of salvation, and what Paul said in 2 Corinthians chapter 6?
Well, obviously, it's outside of the framework of the fulfillment of those things written in the Old Testament, for one. And then you have, as we've mentioned before, that when he says that he was going to restore the land, Paul said in 2 Corinthians chapter 6, now is the day of salvation. Um, and saying that that was the time when he wrote that. It was not a situation where he was calling them back into the land. And that's certainly, thousands of years before 1948. And yet he was calling them back into the new heavens and the new earth, if you please. It was an already but not yet situation, but he was calling them back at that particular time. And because Abraham was looking for that heavenly land, that heavenly country, Hebrews 11, 13 through 16. And then even in Hebrews 13, 14, for here we have no continuing city, but we look for the one about to come. So the text is showing us that what they were to receive in fulfillment was already taking place, while at the same time, the believers were actually leaving the land. They were about to leave the land and would not return to the land. And that's, to me, is very, very important to see that distinction between them. And I was thinking also about, there are several groups of Jews. One group is the group that are the political Zionists. And then you have, of course, those who would be more religious than they. But I remember the gentleman giving 4 tenets that they believed that were critical before they could return to the land. First of all, he said, we are in exile because God put us in exile. Now, I don't think that this has anything to do with the fulfillment of these scriptures, but it just goes to show you the difference in the way even some Christians or Christian Zionists and dispensationalists, believe about these things, and the way even some of the Jews who believe that. So they believe that they're in exile because God placed them there. They also believe that they are not to take the land by force. They're not to use military power or anything to go back into the land. They believe that they are under, God's judgment during this time that they're outside of the land, and that while in the land, while among the nations, they are to live with them in peace. So they're not to cause any kind of wars, disturbances like that, but to live in peace. And they say that they're doing that because of what's found in Jeremiah 25. Go and live in peace and among the nations. And so, and then the last thing is that they could only return back to the land with the Messiah. It's the Messiah who's supposed to lead them back into the land. So that's totally different than what happened in 1948. It's different than what happened in 2 Corinthians chapter 6, which is taking place in the time of the first century. And so that just shows you, those distinctions between, these views that people have regarding it.
I think, William, you mentioned this group of people who are Jews. I would say a tremendous number. I don't know what the percentage is. There are a tremendous percentage of people in the world today, in the religious world, in the Christian religious world, who have no clue whatsoever that there is a major force within Judaism that is adamantly opposed to Zionism.
Yes.
I was in contact with some of them out of Los Angeles some years ago, and I think you were as well, if I'm not mistaken. But these people think that what's going on in Israel today is an abomination in the eyes of God. They think that 1948 was an abomination to God. And that's because of the 4 points that you just delineated, that they're in exile, and they're in exile because of their sin, because God put them in exile because of their sin. They can only go back when God brings them back. And in the meantime, they're supposed to live in peace among whoever they're living among, whom they've been, whatever nation they're in exile with, and only the Messiah can bring them back. And anybody that knows anything about 1948 knows none of those criteria were met, and they know those criteria were not met. That's why they're opposed to Zionism.
And don't forget, no military force to take them back into the land.
That's exactly
now, compare
right.
that with what's happening, and you'll see a stark contrast between those tenets and what's happening.
That's exactly right. And the point that you made a few moments ago, William, to me is such an incredible, it's a subtle point that I'm afraid a lot of people don't catch. But here we have the promise of the restoration to the land in the acceptable time. Paul said in the first century, 2,000 years ago, now is that time. But at the very time that Paul wrote 2 Corinthians, 57, maybe 58 AD? Is that approximately correct? So in just a relatively short period of time, there's going to be a mass exodus from Jerusalem, from Judea, because what did Jesus say? When you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, let the one who reads understand, then let those in Judea flee. Wait a minute. It's not come back, it's get out.
Yes.
And this is in the acceptable time, which Paul said, it's here, folks. It's at work. So I've used this passage so many, many times in conversations with my dispensational friends. Dispensationalism really turns the scenario, the entire narrative, on its head, stands it upside down, and says, well, look what a glorious thing 1948 was. Well, it wasn't glorious because, number one, God never said on any occasion that he would ever bless Israel by a return to the land in a state of unbelief. And yet, as I pointed out, I think a couple of weeks ago, Arnold Fruchtenbaum, a converted Jew, says that 85% of the people who came back or came into the land in 1948 were atheists, agnostics, unbelievers. And we could probably throw in a fourth class. They were not only unbelievers, but they were horribly immoral people. I mean, it's just horrible of the moral decline that has happened in Israel. And this is admitted by leading.
Well, they're saying it's the homosexual capital of the world now.
That's exactly what I was getting ready to say. Israel, Tel Aviv especially,
yes,
is the homosexual capital of the world. And so we're supposed to believe that God, who called homosexuality an abomination, we're supposed to believe that God blessed this, quote, I won't call them a nation, this group of people that were atheists, agnostics, unbelievers, and homosexuals. And God blessed them by bringing them back to the land. That means that God blessed Israel in a state of rebellion, in a state of total unbelief. And he blessed them by bringing them back to the land, and then blessed them for being violent. Now, I understand somebody would jump up and said, well, Israel always had the right to defend herself, and to make war with her nations, etc. So I understand that. But there's a tremendous paradox about the point that these anti-Zionist Jews believe. No, it would be a return in peace, not violence. And so, folks, when we grasp the power of Isaiah 49, that in the acceptable time, that's the time of the restoration of the land. But there's another element of this, William. It's not only the restoration of Israel, is it? The restoration of Israel is supposed to be the restoration and the redemption of creation, is it not?
That's correct.
Okay.
Exactly right.
So if the restoration of the land, he will restore the land, is the time of the restoration of creation, redemption of creation. And Paul said the time, the acceptable time, the day of salvation, had arrived 2,000 years ago. I'll pose my question that I posed to several of the New Heaven, New Earth folks, literal New Heaven, New Earth folks on Facebook a couple of years ago. Here is Paul, who said that time of the restoration of the earth was present 2,000 years ago. Why in the world are we not seeing better trees, clearer water, lions and leopards and what have you, not killing people and eating them, and elephants stampeding and trampling them. Why are we not seeing better bugs, slugs, and mosquitoes? And of course, they
Very good
mocked me.
question.
They mocked me for asking that question.
Yeah, it's interesting that, part of that conversation that I was having this past week was the person who says, well, the gathering and regathering to the land is already taking place. It started back in 1948. So we should see a lot of this going on by now, 50 years or so. Well, it's been 70 years now.
70 years.
Yeah, it's been 70 years. So that's a long time.
That's almost two generations.
Yeah, to restructure everything and see that all the animals are peaceful and the trees are, it's just amazing. But you see none of that. Yet they continue to talk about how bad things are and how worse they're becoming.
Yeah.
How much worse.
I'm reminded in one of my debates, which was held in Oregon some years ago, one question from the audience was, oh man, I've forgotten the fellow's name. Very, very nice guy. But anyway, one of the questions from the audience, are you looking for a nationalistic restoration of Israel and a recreation of physical earth? Same question was asked of Joel McDermott, if you'll remember, in my debate with him in 2012 here in Ardmore. And he said, yes, I'm looking for exactly that thing. Well, it gets back to what we just said. Okay, if you're looking for a recreated new heaven and new earth, physical, then since Paul said that time had arrived, why are we not seeing this redeemed physical creation? And that goes to our physical bodies, doesn't it, William?
Oh, yes. Yes.
I mean, I ought to be tall, dark, and handsome by now, for crying out loud. But unfortunately,
well, it's happening. You talked about your blood pressure before we started.
There
you talked
you go.
about your blood.
Maybe so.
So it's starting from the inside out.
Yeah, good report, ladies and gentlemen. They took my blood pressure to clinic today, and my blood pressure was something like 102 over, I don't know, 30 or 40 or something. Very, very, very low. And the nurse says, "Wow, that's fantastic." When I told my wife what my blood pressure was, that's too low. So anyway, I feel fine. I really do. I feel wonderful. So, but that's what William was referring to. So, folks, this is a really, really critical point. Now, we've been talking about, so let's apply this to the time and to the issue, the subject of the Messianic temple. The time of the restoration of Israel, the time of the restoration of the earth, the time of the restoration of the tribes of Jacob is the time of the Messianic temple. That's a fair statement, is it not, William?
It is.
So when Paul said that the acceptable time was present 2,000 years ago, we have a perfect right to ask. Now, by the way, let me point something out. I just realized I didn't get all of my brush killer off my fingers today. See, isn't that beautiful? Anyway, so here is Paul, who is well aware of the promises of the land, promise of the restoration of Israel. Paul, who is fully aware of every eschatological and soteriological promise made to Israel found in the Old Testament. He is using Isaiah 49 and Ezekiel 37, two key Old Testament prophecy, the restoration of Israel, Messianic temple, the new covenant. Now, by the way, notice, folks, Ezekiel 37:25, I'm going to make a new covenant of peace with them. Isaiah 49, God says, I'll make you, that's the Messiah, to be the covenant for the people. New covenant, both passages. So when we have Paul affirming in the clearest terms possible, now is the acceptable time. Today is the day of salvation. It's the day for the restoration of Israel, restoration of the land, the new covenant. And Paul said it was present 2,000 years ago. Well, William, so someone jumps up and they says, well, William, that's right, but Paul was writing in the already, but not yet. So the restoration of Israel had begun. Okay. but it was not yet. So how's your response to that if they're going to put that not yet in our future 2,000 years later?
Well, if it's an already, then we need to see, as you were saying before, you need to see the temple already going up
At
in the
least the
first century.
foundation laid.
Exactly. The foundation should be laid and a few stones here and there, because that's what you read in scripture, that the foundation was laid and that there were stones that were being built. So where does it exist if it's physical? And that certainly brings about a contradiction and contrast to the statement that Jesus made when he said it was not going to be geocentrically located, and in John chapter 4. So that's, that just creates all kind of problems. But what do we do with all these passages in the New Testament that say you are the temple of God, you are God's building, etc.? They read over that, I guess, as though it has no significance whatsoever. Even though God said he was going to make one without hands, they insist that it must be made with hands, and that, I guess they have a warehouse over there with all the pieces already pre-cut and fabricated, that they're going to put up.
I've been hearing this since the early or late 1960s. I remember being in high school, William, because this has always been kind of a fascination to me. But in the Northwest Arkansas Times and on some radio programs that I listened to at the time, they were talking then about, boy, they're shipping building materials to Jerusalem. They're getting ready to build the temple. We're going to see the beginning of that construction just any day now. That was in the late 60s, folks. Why haven't they done something, for crying out loud? It just doesn't work. And it goes back to this very simple question that we have asked. But since Paul said that the time for the restoration had arrived, and now it's been 2,000 years since he said that, why haven't we seen something? Israel 1948 will not work. And folks, let me encourage you to get a copy of the book that I wrote, Israel 1948, Countdown to Nowhere, in which I talk about the land promises, the new covenant promises, the restoration of Israel promises, et cetera, et cetera. And I show from very clear, very undeniable passages that God never promised to restore Israel in unbelief, that the land never really even belonged to them. According to Leviticus chapter 25 and verse 23, the land belonged to God. And they couldn't have it unless they were faithful to Torah. Well, guess what? William, is this not a valid argument to make? Consider. It's what I made in that little book I just mentioned, that is Israel 1948, Countdown to Nowhere. The very dispensationalists who go to the Old Testament to give us, pardon me, to find the promises of the land, to find the promises of the Messianic temple, they tell us that the law of Moses was fulfilled and passed away in the first century. Some will say even AD 70, but for certain, most of them will say, well, the law of Moses ended at the cross, or even perhaps AD 70. Isn't this a humongous problem to say, on the one hand, the law of Moses passed away in the first century, and yet they're looking for, I don't know, the ashes of a red heifer, which is found in the law of Moses, Numbers chapter 19?
That's a huge problem, because, they're saying the law has passed, all the shadows and types have been fulfilled, etc., and the sacrifices are no longer offered, but yet they have to go back and get them, as you're saying, the red heifer. They've got to reinstitute the sacrifices. And I guess the journey's back to Jerusalem as well, the pilgrimage to Jerusalem for all of the people who are outside. So it is a huge problem in speaking about that. And I can't think of anything that would denigrate the work of Christ more than to resurrect that old system that he died to fulfill. That just negates the entire work of Christ.
I agree with that 100%. And I have seen this so many times in my own ministry, when given the opportunity to actually sit down with someone who is willing to look at the testimony of Scripture and to see the walls just literally crumble before your eyes as they see that God, number one, as I pointed out, the land belonged to God, never belonged to Israel, never belonged to Israel unconditionally. The condition for keeping the land was obedience to the law of Moses. And yet these people with whom you're studying, they acknowledge the law of Moses has been done away with. Well, if the law of Moses has been done away with, as already pointed out, then you can't demand a red heifer, and you can't demand a Levitical priesthood, and you can't demand a temple, and you can't demand any of the things that dispensationalists look forward to if the law of Moses has been done away with. And so, like I said, you study with people and you just start to see the walls crumbling down.
And then you ask them, okay, well, what's going to happen to this temple that they're going to rebuild? It's got to be destroyed.
Yeah. That's exactly right. And furthermore, in the dispensational schema, the very first temple in Jerusalem to be rebuilt is actually what I call the temple of the man of sin. Because according to the dispensational view, after the rapture, the man of sin will arise, and he will deceive Israel into signing a peace treaty, and the nations deceive them into signing a peace treaty with Israel, and it will be through his manipulations, his machinations, that the temple at Jerusalem will actually be rebuilt. So in effect, the next coming temple will not be a messianic temple at all. It will be the temple of the man of sin. He's the one to authorize it. He's the one to sign the peace treaty that allows it to be built. He's the one behind the whole thing.
Yeah, that's really a shocker. That's really a downer.
I don't know how any Jew, vaguely familiar with the dispensational paradigm could say, "Oh yeah, let's do this. Where's the man of sin? Let's sign him up here." It's shocking. It truly is shocking what the entire dispensational schema brings in as their vision of the future. And I'm sure I don't have to tell anyone, or at least anyone familiar with the dispensational schema, as they look for the messianic temple in the Great Tribulation, which is immediately before the second coming of Christ, when he will rebuild the temple. 3/5 of the world's population and 2/3 of the Jews will be killed. And by the way, some of these anti-Zionist Jews are very quick to point this out to their Jewish brethren and say, you're joining forces with the dispensationalists, and the only reason the dispensationalists want you back in the land is so that you'll die. And yet, the Jewish authorities in Israel today just gladly wrap their arms around dispensational teachers and leaders who are behind the scenes looking forward to the day when 2/3 of them will die, be killed violently by the Antichrist.
Yep.
So now then, as we promised, and I think that's a sufficient discussion of the perils, if you please, of dispensationalism when we talk about the restoration to the land in order to talk about the restoration of Jerusalem and the temple. Folks, don't lose sight of this singular fact that we've been emphasizing for a couple of weeks. Paul, 2,000 years ago, said, now's the acceptable time. But the acceptable time was the time for the restoration to the land, thus the time of the restoration of the temple. And not only Paul, but Peter, as William was pointing out a few moments ago, said that the building, there was a temple undergoing construction in the first century, but it was not a physical temple. And the people, the Christians, the faithful Jews, were fleeing the land, not being restored to it. That really should give anyone, it seems to me, real serious pause before pointing to 1948 and say, oh, wow, what a marvelous miracle that was. No miracle involved, none whatsoever. It was not done with God's blessings, unless God 180 degrees out, changed what he had written in Scripture about the conditions for Israel's return to the land and who would be returned to the land. I got to bring up one other passage here because this is so powerful to me. It's Ezekiel chapter 20, 30 and following, in which the Lord, here is Judah and Jerusalem going into Babylonian captivity. And the Lord said that the time is going to come. He said, I'm going to bring you out from among the nations. I'm going to bring you into the wilderness, and there I'm going to bring you into the bond of the covenant. Now, the very terminology of bond of the covenant should indicate to anyone who's familiar with that kind of language, this is not going to be a good thing. What God was saying, I'm going to bring to bear, I am going to tighten down the bonds and the strictures of the covenant. And so he continues to define and to describe what he meant by, I'm going to bring you into the bond of the covenant. I will purge out the rebels that are among you, and they, rebels, will not enter the land. And yet, dispensationalists say, oh, look, Israel 1948, Israel returned to the land. 85% of them were atheists, agnostics, and unbelievers and homosexuals. If that's not a direct head-butting contrast and contradiction with Scripture, I do not know what is.
Yeah.
And
now,
yet they proclaim that week after week after week from their pulpits.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Okay, so you're talking about the restoration of Israel to the land. Of course, we understand it in the context of 2 Corinthians 6 as we've been discussing. Do you see that tied in with Acts 1, 6, and 7, and with Acts 3 as well? And I remember that during some of your earlier debates, there was this discussion about Acts 3 and verse 21. So would you comment on that for a moment or two?
Oh, yeah. The word in Acts chapter 3, when Peter said that Christ would return at the consummation, as you rightly pointed out in your comments to McPhelan, not to start the restoration, but to consummate it. But Peter said, whom heaven must receive until the restoration of all things foretold by all of the prophets. Well, the word restoration there is from the Greek word apokatastasis. Apokatastasis means to set right that which is broken, that which is not right. It was used in medical terms for broken bones to set, you got broken bones, you set them back proper. It was used of political correction. If you have moral corruption, political corruption, et cetera, injustice going in, then you have reform taking place and you have the correction of the injustice and the corruption, what have you. Pardon me. And I would point out that Jesus said that John the Baptizer was Elijah who was to come and to restore all things. So John was the one who was supposed to initiate the restoration, by the way, which is one reason why Paul could say we're living in the time of restoration, because John the Baptizer was Elijah who would restore all things. So once again, we have to ask the question, number one, what's the nature of the restoration that John as Elijah initiated? Well, according to Malachi chapter 4, verse 3, 4 and following, he will turn the hearts of the fathers to the sons of the hearts of the sons to the fathers. That's a moral restoration. That's a relational restoration. And you'll forgive me for doing this digression. Some years ago, Grant Jeffrey, who was a very, very, very prominent and popular dispensationalist at one time, he actually wrote a book entitled The Glorious Return. And he said there's not one single Old Testament prophecy that was ever fulfilled spiritually and not literally and physically. And the moment I read that, when I was reading his book, my mind just literally exploded. And I go, okay, Isaiah chapter 40, a voice crying in the wilderness, make straight in the desert a highway for our God. Let every valley be filled. Let every mountain be made low. And here comes John John chapter 1, 30 and following. Here come the ambassage of the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the scribes out to John and says, who are you? Are you the Messiah? No. Are you the prophet? No. Who are you? I'm the voice of one crying in the wilderness. So John is the one to fill up all the valleys and to bring all the mountains down. William, can you tell me what verse it is in Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John that describes his road grading, horticultural, whatever activities where he did that?
Well, you've got I think one is Mark 1, and let me find them real quick. There's Mark 1, and then you have Luke chapter 3 and Matthew chapter 3, I think. But let me look at the one in Mark. I think that's one for sure.
I don't think you missed the point, or I think you missed the point of my question. Can you point me to a New Testament passage that describes John out shoveling dirt?
Oh, no. Yeah, I did miss that. No. He has his spiritual road grader, right?
Yeah. I was thinking,
but no, he's not driving a physical or material, big caterpillar going through the land of Israel, leveling off the dirt and everything and filling in the holes, which is, what they would think is happening.
But the point that you were driving at is Mark chapter 1, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, a voice in the wilderness, make straight in the highway, a desert for our God. And so Mark is identifying John as the voice of the wilderness. And
yes,
John identifies himself as the voice in the wilderness. And of course, Luke 1:17 identifies him as Elijah, or the one coming in the spirit and the power of Elijah. And so there's no question that John was viewed as the Elijah. And Jesus even went so far as to say in Matthew chapter 11, the Jews came out to Jesus and asked him, or they came out to Jesus, and Jesus said, what did you come out in the desert to see, in the wilderness to see? Did you come out to see a reed shaken by the wind? Did you come out to see a prophet? He said, well, let me tell you something. There's never been a prophet greater than John. No greater prophet ever than John the Baptizer. But the one who's in the kingdom, the least in the kingdom, is greater than John. So Jesus's view of John as an eschatological figure, I've said this many, many times, William. I lay it out in my book, Elijah Has Come, a solution for Romans 11:25-27. Apart from Jesus and Paul, I am absolutely convinced there is not another more important eschatological figure than John the Baptizer, who is identified as Elijah, as the messenger, and as the voice. He's incredible.
Yeah, let's go back to the concept of his voice crying out in the wilderness. Wasn't John's work all in the land of Israel?
Certainly was.
So how can the wilderness there be outside of the land so that they have to come back in? They're in the land, and yet he's calling them out of the wilderness, which shows that the wilderness can't be a physical wilderness from that perspective. And if that's the case, it can't be physical land that he's calling them into, by calling them out of that. And then you have the text in Luke 9:31 where Jesus begins that exile, in his crucifixion. So that's another statement that would just go against the grain of talking about, them coming out of a literal wilderness from that perspective. And so
let's let's build on that because it's so salient. I mean, it's critically important. John never called anybody to come from Rome back to Israel. He never called anybody from Macedonia, Thessalonica. Come on back home, guys. Come on. Never sent out messengers to bring them back into the physical land. And yet he's part of the restoration. And let me point something out to build on my notification of that Greek word, apokatastasis. That word is used in Jeremiah and some of the other prophets to speak of the restoration of Judah back to Jerusalem after the Babylonian captivity. So it had connotations and linkages with a physical return to the land. But that was typological. It's obviously typological because now Peter is using it. John, as Elijah, was doing it. But as we've already pointed out, he wasn't calling people back to the physical land at all. So we have the historical typological events from Babylonian captivity back to the land. And then we have this concept, just like these anti-Zionists believe, there is a spiritual exile. And that, if there's anything that Jesus taught, it seems to me this is so extremely powerful. And I like the way N.T. Wright in his works expresses it, that the Jews of the first century understood, even though they're living in the land, they still believe themselves to be living in exile, in captivity. Well, wait a minute. They're not in Egypt. They're not in Assyria. They're not in Babylon. They're not in Persia. But they still thought they were in exile. They realized it was because of sin. That's why they were looking for the Messiah. And to me, William, this gets back to your point that you just did a series on 1 Corinthians 15, and that Paul's focus in 1 Corinthians 15 is not bodies coming out of the grave. It is about forgiveness. It is about the work of Christ to bring about forgiveness. And this segues perfectly into some of the things that we've seen earlier, and that is in the Old Testament, Israel, when she violated the Tanakh, what happened? God sent her into exile, and in exile, she was described as being dead. Correct. Not biologically, but she was sin death because sin had separated her from God, from the temple, the land, the city, etc., etc. That was true of the 10 northern tribes in Isaiah chapter 27, 9 and following. It was true of Judah when being sent off into Babylonian captivity. And thus it was true of all 12 tribes, as Ezekiel envisions all 12 tribes in captivity, dead in the graves, not biologically dead.
Now, I would see, and I'm not sure if you do, but I would see the statement in Acts 3 and verse 20 where it talks about the time of refreshing, which it means to revive, to put breath into. And I think that's going back to Ezekiel 37 as well. It's an already but not yet from that perspective.
The times are refreshing. The word refreshing there is anaxusios, if I pronounce that anywhere.
That's close enough.
That's a tough word to pronounce to me, but it means relief, according to F.F. Bruce and a bunch of other scholars. But you're right, refreshing and revival are included in that. Mm-hmm. So when we look at it from Peter's perspective of the restoration of all things, and that is inclusive of Israel. Now, it's interesting that Thayer's Greek lexicon, when he is describing or defining, apokatastasis, he says, this is the restoration of Israel. Well, I think he's onto something because that's the way it was used in the Old Testament. But to limit it to that, may be a little bit short-sighted, because it involves bringing mankind through the work of Christ, reconciling all men to God. So it's not strictly the Jews. It's a little broader than that. But again, the point of it is, all of these terms that we're looking at, restoration is resurrection. Just like we've talked on other occasions, righteousness is resurrection, because unrighteousness is death. And this will segue pretty well into what we'll want to cover next week. Down here in Isaiah chapter 49, notice that the Lord says, let me see exactly which verse it was. That's crazy because I've been studying on it today. That's bothersome. Why can't I find that verse? Verse 9. Duh.
I thought that's what you was looking for, but
I don't know why. Like I said, I've been studying on it all day, the concept of darkness. Notice what the Lord says, that in this acceptable day, the time of salvation, He says, you will say to the prisoners, go forth. To those who are in darkness, show yourself. Now, folks, Hastings Bible Dictionary, an extremely helpful resource, says that the term darkness, which is from the Greek word nux, is used a tremendous number of times metaphorically to speak of death. Job does, most assuredly does it in Job chapter 10, verse 20 and 21. He says to his, quote, friends, unquote, who are gathered around him, telling him what a rascal he must be to be suffering all this kind of stuff. He said, now leave me alone. Just give me a little bit of comfort until I go my way to the place from which I shall not return, to darkness and the shadow of death. So here's Job speaking of his a death that he was actually desiring at the time. He's referring to it as darkness. And any number, the Theological Dictionary of the New Testament, edited by Colin Brown, likewise talks about darkness being a metaphor for death itself. And so to be in darkness was to be dead. So we'll talk about this more next week. But what we're trying to get everyone to see right now is to emphasize that the time in which Paul was living in the first century 2,000 years ago was the time for that to begin. And let's return to one other point, William, that we have some people say, well, yeah, it all began. Paul said, yeah, this is the acceptable time. Today is the salvation. But it's the already, but not yet. Well, what's the answer to the not yet? Doesn't every New Testament writer have something to say about the not yet?
Yeah, they do. And the one thing they don't say is that it turns into a different nature than the already.
Yeah.
So that's important. But it was not the far distant not yet. It was an imminent not yet. It was a not yet that was coming in a little while. That was shortly to come to pass. That was at hand. It was near. And so that's one point that needs to be understood or needs to be accepted because they understand it. They understand the implications of it, but they just don't accept it. And so it was an already but not yet in terms of a not too far distant future based on the time statements that are found there.
I think sometimes, William, that some futurists just throw up the quote argument, oh, yeah, that's an already but not yet, as nothing but a desperate defense mechanism, hoping that we won't say, well, you're exactly right, but what does the Bible say about the not yet? Your opponent in the recent debate, what was his name?
Yes, Scott Clem.
Scott Clem. Oh, well, yeah, I accept that. It was just already, but not yet. Well, he doesn't really accept it because he refused to see and to acknowledge the not yet was, now in a very, very little while, the one who's coming will come and will not delay.
Exactly.
And so that, like I said, our opponents in the futurist camp, they throw out the already but not yet argument to detract attention, to deflect attention away from, number one, the force of the already. And then, like you just hinted at a moment ago, they want to change the not yet into a different nature from the already. They say, oh yeah, the already was spiritual, the not yet is physical.
Yeah, they reverse the order. They change the order, and Paul they ignore the time.
That which is spiritual is not first, but that which is natural. And invariably, when people start talking about resurrection, for instance, what do? Oh, well, yeah, we're spiritually resurrected now. We're waiting on physical resurrection. Again, that reverses the order. That reverses the modus operandi. You look at the typology of Scripture, and pardon me, something I mentioned just a few moments ago. You have a typological return of Judah from Babylonian captivity. That was a literal physical return. May I use the term natural? Now, that's not the proper definition of psukikos in 1 Corinthians 15, but it's physical nonetheless. But what did it point to? It pointed to the spiritual return from sin exile. And so we're dealing with these concepts here that are so powerful and so important to see how here's what Isaiah foretold. Here's what Paul said, the time has come. And you cannot extrapolate Paul's the time has come into 2,000 years waiting for its consummation when Paul and the rest of the New Testament writers say that what had begun was about to be consummated.
That's correct.
And with that, folks, we are out of time. Very good discussion tonight. Appreciate you being with us. William, great to be with you as always. With that, I'm going to say good night. God bless.
All right. Night.